The basement smelled like dust, wet concrete, and something burned. Not a recent fire, the kind of char that soaks into walls over months, the residue of a building that had died slowly, floor by floor, room by room. Private Serhiy Kovalenko pressed his back against what remained of a load-bearing wall and listened. Above him, 3 floors of the building had collapsed inward in a rough pyramid of broken slabs. The structure no longer existed in any architectural sense. What it had become was a layered obstacle field, a series of shadowed gaps, a defensive position that no Russian fire control system had a pre-registered coordinate for, because it had not looked like this 6 months ago. Outside, somewhere in the gray rubble of what used to be Marinka's central district, a Russian assault team was moving. He could not see them. He did not need to. Their footsteps on broken brick carried through the foundation stones like a telegraph wire. This is the story of how Ukraine's 60th Separate Mechanized Brigade turned one of the most devastated towns in Europe into an almost impenetrable fortress. Not through technology, not through firepower advantage, through doctrine, through patience, and through a clear understanding of how rubble changes the mathematics of war. Marinka is, or was, a small industrial town on the western edge of the Donetsk agglomeration. Population before the war, around 10,000. Distance to the administrative boundary of Russian-occupied Donetsk city, less than 3 kilometers. You can see the city's high-rises from the right position in Marinka. That proximity is the entire strategic logic of the Russian offensive there. Control Marinka, and you hold the western flank of Greater Donetsk, push Ukrainian fire positions further from the city, ease pressure on Russian logistics inside occupied Donetsk, and straighten a salient that had been a Ukrainian fire advantage since 2014. Russian forces began systematic pressure on Marinka in late 2022, intensifying through 2023. By the time the 60th Mechanized Brigade was heavily committed to the defense of the town's central and northern sectors, Marinka had already been subjected to months of sustained artillery, glide bomb, and direct fire assault. Buildings had been hit, re-hit, and hit again. The urban grid, the street lines, the building corners, the sight lines that military planners use to orient in a town, had been progressively erased. What emerged from that destruction was not a weakened defensive environment. It was a transformed one. The 60th Separate Mechanized Brigade had been built and rebuilt through the war. Its soldiers had experience in positional defense from earlier sectors of the front, and by the time its elements were anchoring the Marinka defense, they were not the same institution that had existed on paper in early 2022. They had developed specific skills for exactly this kind of environment, dense urban terrain physically destroyed to the point where conventional military doctrine, which assumes recognizable buildings with intact floors and walls, no longer applied. Russia, in contrast, was attempting to do something that looks simple on a map and is brutally costly in practice. Clear a built-up area structure by structure, block by block, against a prepared and experienced defender. Russian forces committed elements from multiple units to the Marinka axis over the course of the extended battle, including contract soldiers and mobilized infantry supported by armor and artillery. By some estimates, Russian assault groups cycled through the town in rotations, with fresh units fed in after previous ones had been worn down. Ukrainian General Staff reporting and geolocated social media footage confirmed the presence of at least 3 distinct Russian assault unit designations operating in the Marinka sector across the extended battle period. What's most surprising about the Marinka fight isn't the duration, though holding a position under that kind of sustained pressure for as long as Ukrainian forces did is itself remarkable. It's the mechanism. The defenders did not hold Marinka because they had superior firepower. They held it for as long as they did because they had superior understanding of the terrain they were standing on. Here is where the doctrine begins. When a building is partially destroyed by artillery or air attack, it does not become tactically neutral. It becomes something stranger and more complex. The floors that remain are unpredictable in their load-bearing capacity. Staircases may be intact, partially intact, or simply gone. Walls that have been blown open create firing positions that did not exist in the original architecture. Basements that were once sealed are now connected to adjacent basements through rubble-choked breaches that can be cleared and used as movement corridors. Upper floors that have partially collapsed create elevated positions approachable only from specific angles. Angles that an attacker working from a map or satellite image cannot anticipate without actually entering the structure. The 60th Brigade did not simply defend buildings. They mapped this new architecture. Reconnaissance elements would assess each damaged structure and identify what positions offered covered movement, what positions offered observation, what positions offered fire on likely Russian approach routes, and, critically, what positions could be abandoned quickly when they came under fire, and along what routes. That last element is central to understanding the doctrine. A fundamental problem in urban defense is registration. Once you fire from a position, you reveal it. Once you reveal it, the attacker calls for mortars, artillery, or direct fire, and if you stay, you die. The traditional solution is to have so many positions that losing one does not matter. In intact urban terrain, this is manageable. In rubble, it is both easier and harder. Easier because the terrain itself provides countless micro-positions. Harder because movement between them is physically treacherous and takes longer. The 60th's answer, reconstructed from geolocated footage, accounts from Ukrainian military media, and the observable pattern of their resistance, was to treat strongpoints as temporary by design. A position was not held until it was overrun. It was held until fire on it exceeded a threshold, then vacated in a planned withdrawal to a pre-identified fallback position, with the original position sometimes prepared for the next phase of use by a different team. Russian forces would assault a position, take it, and find it empty or booby-trapped. They would then be in an exposed forward position themselves, in terrain they had not mapped, under observation from positions they had not yet identified. Think about what that means for the attacker's cost calculus. Every Russian assault group that moved into cleared rubble was stepping into a zone where Ukrainian teams had pre-mapped the exits, and they had not. The fight was asymmetric not in weapons, but in information about the physical space. At this point in the battle, let me stop and frame what was actually at stake along this axis, because the Marinka fight cannot be understood without the broader Donetsk front context. The Russian operational goal in the western Donetsk sector was to straighten and advance the front line west of the city. Marinka was one of several towns on this axis, along with Avdiivka to the north, that formed the outer crust of Ukrainian defensive positions. Russian military planners and their political leadership needed visible progress in this sector to demonstrate that the offensive was producing results. The sustained grinding at Marinka served that purpose even when daily territorial gains were measured in meters or individual buildings. For Ukraine, Marinka was not intrinsically the most critical piece of terrain on the front, but the cost it was imposing on Russian forces was. Every Russian assault group chewed up in the rubble of Marinka was a group not available elsewhere. Every week of Russian personnel and equipment consumed in the town was a week of attrition at rates Russia could not sustain indefinitely without drawing down reserves needed on other axes. Time in this equation was a weapon. The 60th Brigade was wielding it. I spent time going through the available geolocated footage from the Marinka sector, and one detail kept recurring in a way that changes how you read the whole battle. The consistent presence of Ukrainian FPV drone operators in upper floor and elevated rubble positions, even in buildings that were structurally compromised to the point of danger. This was not recklessness. It was a calculated trade. A drone operator in an elevated rubble position in a building that looks, from the outside, to be completely destroyed has a significant advantage. Russian forces assessing the building visually would typically deprioritize it as a fire threat. The structure appeared non-functional. A thermal or optical sensor looking for the heat signature of a drone or the movement of an operator in a darkened, rubble-filled space is a much harder problem than a sensor looking for a position in a recognizable building with windows and floors. The 60th's FPV teams were exploiting the visual ambiguity of destroyed structures as a form of camouflage. The FPV drones themselves, modified racing quadcopters carrying RPG warheads or improvised explosive payloads, had proved effective against Russian armor and infantry in open terrain across the front. In Marinka, they served a more specific purpose. Russian assault teams approaching through rubble often lost cohesion. The irregular terrain forced soldiers to move in smaller groups, to pick individual paths through debris, to separate from the heavy armor that could not navigate the blocked streets. This made them individually vulnerable in ways that a consolidated unit in open terrain would not be. An FPV strike against an assault group in a rubble corridor is geometrically different from one in an open field. The terrain channels the target. The team at the receiving end has fewer directions to disperse. The operator, elevated, can see into the corridor before the assault team emerges from it. The combination of terrain channeling and elevated observation gave Ukrainian FPV teams a kill ratio in Marinka that raw range specifications of the drone cannot capture. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface until you look at it carefully. Russia had significant advantages in volume of fire. Artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, air-delivered ordnance. Russian forces were expending ammunition at rates that dwarfed Ukrainian defensive fire. And yet that firepower advantage was being partially neutralized by the very destruction it had already caused. The rubble fields that Russian artillery had created over months of bombardment were now working against the attacker. Shell craters became cover. Collapsed walls became obstacle lines that channeled Russian approach routes. The ruins of the buildings Russia had destroyed were the material from which the defense was built. This is the arithmetic of rubble warfare. Past fire creates future cover for whoever controls the terrain. And in Marinka, the 60th Brigade controlled the terrain in the sense that mattered. They knew it. They had mapped its useful features, and they were prepared to use it in ways the attacker was not. Question for anyone following this conflict seriously: how many FPV strikes does it take to stop a Russian company-level assault through a rubble corridor? The answer depends not on the number of drones, but on where you position the operators and whether you have pre-mapped the approach routes. Think about that. The answer at the end of this section will reframe how you look at the loss figures. The subterranean dimension of the Marinka defense is the element that received the least attention in early reporting, but is arguably the most important for understanding how the 60th maintained coherent defensive positions under sustained attack. Marinka, like most Soviet-era industrial towns, had a basement infrastructure built to Cold War civil defense standards. Individual building basements, shelter spaces, and utility corridors existed beneath the town's footprint before a single shell landed in 2022. As the fighting progressed and the above-ground architecture was progressively destroyed, this subterranean network became increasingly critical. Ukrainian engineers and combat troops worked to connect basement spaces through rubble breaches, creating movement corridors that allowed defenders to transit between positions without exposing themselves above ground. These were not sophisticated tunnels in the military engineering sense. They were passages cleared through the rubble of collapsed floors, reinforced where necessary, sometimes barely passable, but providing covered movement in a town where above-ground movement meant near certain observation and likely fire. The military value of this network was substantial. A defending team under fire on the eastern side of a block could withdraw through a basement passage and emerge on the western side, having avoided both the fire zone and any Russian observation of their movement. This made Ukrainian positions far more resilient than they appeared. From the Russian perspective, suppressing a position with fire should have suppressed the defenders, should have meant that the assault team could then advance into a vacated or weakened position. But the basement network meant that suppression of the above-ground position did not necessarily suppress the defenders. They had moved underground and were now in a different position, watching the assault team enter what they thought was cleared terrain. Intercepted Russian communications from this period, fragments of which circulated through Ukrainian military intelligence channels and were partially reported in Ukrainian media, reflected a pattern of confusion about exactly this dynamic. Russian assault teams reported clearing positions only to encounter fire from unexpected directions. Fire was requested on positions that had just been taken. The physical logic of the defense was not mapping onto the expectations built from above-ground observation or satellite imagery. This matters beyond Marinka. It points to a general principle about contested rubble environments that NATO doctrine writers and urban warfare planners should be studying. The destruction of above-ground architecture does not eliminate defensive utility. It redistributes it downward and increases its complexity. An attacker who calculates that sustained bombardment has neutralized defensive positions by destroying the buildings those positions occupied is solving the wrong problem. The buildings were never the defense. The terrain was. The arms and equipment balance in the Marinka sector told a story of deliberate economy on the Ukrainian side and significant attrition on the Russian. Ukrainian forces defending in this environment were not expending expensive precision munitions to hold ground. HIMARS rockets, which cost approximately $60,000 to $70,000 each, were not the primary instruments of tactical defense inside Marinka. Artillery, mortars, FPV drones, and small arms were. The defenders were conserving the high-cost, long-range systems for logistics interdiction, the supply lines feeding Russian forces in the Donetsk sector, while the close fight in the town was handled with high-volume, lower-cost systems. Russian forces, in contrast, were expending significant resources trying to reduce prepared positions in rubble terrain. Tank support for infantry assaults exposed armor to FPV and anti-tank missile fire in channeled terrain, where the tank's mobility advantage was minimal and its thermal and visual signature was unchanged. Multiple armored vehicle losses were documented in the Marinka sector through geolocated footage. BMP series infantry fighting vehicles, T-72 variants, engineering and mine-clearing equipment committed to breach attempts through rubble barriers. Each vehicle loss represented not just the equipment cost, but the combat power decrement of a unit that had lost its armored support and now faced a terrain environment on foot that had already proven lethal to vehicles. If you've been following this conflict seriously, here's why this particular exchange rate matters beyond the tactical local picture. Russia's armored vehicle production and repair capacity, while significant, was running against a depletion curve that the Marinka fight was accelerating. Oryx open-source tracking confirmed hundreds of Russian armored vehicles as destroyed, damaged, or captured across the Donetsk axis during the extended period of the Marinka battle. Not all of those losses were in Marinka itself, but the dynamic that produced them, attacking prepared defenders in rubble terrain with armor that could not exploit its mobility, was the Marinka dynamic replicated at multiple points along the front. Here's the take that will probably generate disagreement, but it needs saying. Russian military planners chose to feed assault waves into Marinka at a cost-to-benefit ratio that was, by any conventional military assessment, unfavorable, and they did so for a sustained period. The most charitable interpretation is that they assessed the attrition as acceptable, given the strategic value of the objective and the domestic political requirement for visible progress. The less charitable interpretation is that the system lacked the feedback mechanisms to translate the tactical cost data into operational-level decisions that would have changed the approach. Either explanation is alarming for how it describes the way the Russian military operates. What strikes me about this pattern is what it reveals about institutional learning under sustained combat pressure. Ukrainian forces adapted continuously. The rotating strongpoints, the basement networks, the FPV positioning in Rubble, the deliberate terrain mapping. Russian forces, facing those adaptations, continued to apply approaches that the tactical results were demonstrating did not work. That gap in institutional adaptation speed is as significant as any equipment loss number. Now we reach the point where the defensive logic of Marinka intersects with the broader question of time. If you're subscribing to this channel for OSINT breakdowns at this level of detail, hit that subscribe button. We do this analysis every week, and what comes next is why the timeline of Marinka matters for understanding the entire Donetsk axis trajectory. The 60th Brigade's defense of Marinka was not a defense that held forever. By late 2023 and into 2024, Russian forces made significant advances in the town, ultimately controlling most of the built-up area. This outcome is sometimes presented as a Russian victory, and in the narrowest territorial sense, it was. They took the Rubble. They advanced their line by the width of a small industrial town. But victory in attritional urban warfare is more complex than that. The relevant metrics are not just territorial, they are temporal and material. How long did it take? What did it cost? What was the opportunity cost of the forces committed to this axis versus alternative employment? Russian forces consumed the better part of 2 years making progress through Marinka. The units that rotated through the assault on the town sustained casualties that degraded their readiness for operations elsewhere. Equipment losses in the sector, tallied across the engagement period, represented a meaningful fraction of Russian armored strength in the broader southern Donetsk sector. And critically, every day that Russian forces were focused on grinding through Marinka's Rubble was a day they were not generating momentum on other axes that might have produced operationally significant results. The 60th Brigade and the Ukrainian forces rotating through the Marinka defense more broadly converted a structurally unfavorable tactical situation, outnumbered, outgunned in raw firepower terms, defending a position being systematically destroyed, into a strategic delay operation of significant duration. They did this not because they had a technological edge, but because they had a doctrinal edge in the specific environment they were fighting in. One detail that stayed with me going through the available footage and accounts: the consistency of Ukrainian defensive discipline in rotating out of positions before they became death traps. The temptation in urban combat is to hold a specific piece of terrain past the point of rational cost, a building, a corner, a block, because leaving feels like abandonment. The 60th Brigade appears to have trained this instinct out of their defensive operations. Positions were not held for emotional or symbolic reasons. They were held for tactical ones and vacated when tactical conditions changed. The Rubble would create a new position 5 meters away. The defenders would use that one next. That discipline is harder to develop than any piece of equipment. It requires trust between soldiers and commanders. Trust that the plan accounts for the withdrawal, that the fallback position has been prepared, that leaving the current position is not failure but maneuver. Building that institutional trust under combat pressure, in a unit simultaneously sustaining casualties and integrating replacements who need to learn the doctrine, is a command achievement that deserves more analysis than it typically receives. Drop a comment below. Do you think the Russian military's failure to adapt its assault tactics in Marinka reflects a structural problem in how it processes tactical feedback, or was this a deliberate command decision to accept the cost? It's a real question, and the answer shapes how you evaluate what comes next on this axis. The satellite imagery record of Marinka's destruction across the engagement period is one of the starkest visual documents of what sustained urban combat does to human-built environments. Maxar Technologies and Planet Labs imagery captured the progressive destruction of the town's building stock over months. Block by block, the satellite record showed standing walls becoming rubble fields being displaced by subsequent impacts, entire blocks reduced to undifferentiated debris. What that imagery also showed, to analysts reading it carefully, was the persistence of Ukrainian defensive activity inside terrain that should have been indefensible by any conventional assessment. Thermal signatures, vehicle movement in approaches, evidence of continued fortification work, all of it visible in the record alongside the destruction. The town was being consumed and simultaneously inhabited by defenders who had made the consumption itself into a defensive tool. Ukrainian military analysis of the Marinka experience, some of it published in Ukrainian defense media and some available through accounts of officers who served in the sector, has begun extracting doctrinal lessons from the fight. Several themes come up consistently. First, rubble is an asset, not merely a liability. Units training for urban combat need to train specifically in destroyed terrain, not just in intact or lightly damaged buildings. The skills are different. Navigation in rubble, movement through basement passages, orientation without recognizable architectural features. These require specific training that conventional urban combat exercises do not provide. Second, integrating FPV capability into defensive operations in rubble terrain produces results that outperform its cost by a substantial margin. The combination of elevated observation positions in destroyed buildings and FPV engagement of channeled assault elements is a specifically rubble terrain capability. It does not work the same way in intact urban terrain, where the operator positions are more predictable and the assault elements less channeled. Doctrine for rubble defense needs to treat FPV integration as a primary combat element, not a supplementary one. Third, the subterranean dimension of rubble defense needs deliberate development, not improvised exploitation. Ukrainian forces in Marinka developed their basement network partly through deliberate engineering and partly through improvisation under pressure. A unit that arrives at a rubble position with a pre-planned approach to subsurface connectivity will be significantly more effective than one that develops it under fire. These lessons are being studied, not just in Kyiv. NATO's training establishments, including the Joint Warfare Center in Norway and the various national training centers that have incorporated Ukraine war lessons into their curricula, are wrestling with what Marinka and similar engagements mean for doctrine. The urban combat manuals that NATO armies trained against before 2022 assumed a different kind of urban terrain. The Marinka experience, along with Bakhmut and Avdiivka, is generating a new category: the contested rubble city, where the physical destruction of the urban environment is so advanced that the fight is occurring in something that is neither a city nor open terrain, but a third type of environment requiring its own doctrine. For NATO planners thinking about defense of Baltic cities, Polish infrastructure, or any urban terrain that might be contested against Russian-style assault, the Marinka lessons are not abstract. They are operationally specific: similar terrain, similar adversary, similar tactics, and a documented example of how prepared defenders can multiply their combat power against numerically superior attackers by understanding the terrain better than the attacker does. The historical parallel is worth noting. The defense of Stalingrad in 1942-43, the fight that gave urban rubble warfare its modern doctrinal foundation, demonstrated the same principle. Soviet defenders under Chuikov developed what they called storm group tactics, specifically adapted to fighting in destroyed terrain, using the ruins to negate German firepower superiority and force close-range combat where the attacker's advantages in armor and air support were minimized. The 60th Brigade's approach in Marinka was not the same doctrine. The technology, the weapons, the strategic context are all different, but the underlying logic is recognizable across 80 years. Rubble levels the playing field. A prepared defender in Rubble has advantages that intact terrain would not give them. Do you think history is repeating its tactical lessons here, or has modern technology fundamentally changed what urban rubble defense means? The cost of the Marinka fight, in the terms that matter most for strategic assessment, is difficult to quantify precisely, but possible to bound. Russian forces committed to the town, across the engagement period, experienced vehicle losses documented in the hundreds through open-source tracking. Personnel casualties on the Russian side, estimated from the rate of assault activity and the documented defensive effectiveness, were significant, certainly in the thousands across the extended period, with some Ukrainian military assessments suggesting considerably more. These are not independently verifiable figures, but they are consistent with the observable pace of Russian assault operations and the documented effectiveness of Ukrainian defensive fire. The cost to Ukraine was also real. The 60th Brigade and other Ukrainian units cycling through the Marinka defense sustained casualties that are not publicly detailed at unit level. Soldiers were killed and wounded holding positions in terrain that was being actively demolished around them. The psychological cost of extended rubble combat, the duration, the isolation, the constant artillery, the close quarters nature of the fighting, is a dimension of the battle that unit accounts make clear without quantifying. What the strategic exchange produced was time. The Donetsk axis was slowed. Russian progress toward the deeper operational objectives in the western Donetsk sector was measured in kilometers per month rather than the kilometers per day that operational level advances require. Ukrainian forces used that time, not perfectly, not without loss, but used it to continue defensive preparation in depth, to receive and integrate new equipment, to develop the capabilities that would extend the defense further. The town of Marinka ceased to be a meaningful defensive asset in the conventional sense as Russian forces worked through it. But the idea of Marinka, the doctrine it tested and demonstrated under the hardest possible conditions, is very much alive. Somewhere in Ukraine's military system, planners are looking at the next contested town, the next rubble field that will be created by sustained Russian fire, and they are thinking about basement corridors and rotating strongpoints and FPV teams in collapsed upper floors. They are thinking about how to turn the next act of destruction into the next defensive position. Would Russia have avoided this cost if it had developed a genuine breach capability specifically adapted to rubble terrain rather than assaulting with formations and tactics designed for different environments? Could a different approach, slower, more methodical, more engineering-heavy, have cracked the Marinka defense at lower cost? How does the rubble warfare doctrine that the 60th Brigade demonstrated here change what urban defense means for NATO allies facing Russian-style assault? And what's the next contested town on this axis? And will Russian forces have developed the adaptations to make the cost different this time? These are the questions that Marinka leaves open. They are the questions that any serious student of this war and any planner thinking about its future course needs to be sitting with. Similar tactics were used, and similarly costly lessons were learned by attackers in the battles for Hue in 1968, in Grozny in 1994, and 1999, in Fallujah in 2004. Each time, the attacker eventually prevailed in the territorial sense. Each time, the cost was substantially higher than pre-battle estimates, and the doctrine required for the environment was learned under fire rather than before it. History keeps presenting this lesson. The question is whether the relevant actors are actually reading it. The 60th Separate Mechanized Brigade held a dying town and made the dying expensive. That is the most precise description of what happened in Marinka. Not a victory in the triumphalist sense, not a defeat in the catastrophist sense. A costly, grinding, professionally executed defensive operation that imposed time and material costs on an attacker that could not afford them as freely as it assumed it could. The rubble that Russia made, Ukraine used. That is the doctrine of Marinka, and it will matter again. If this kind of detailed OSINT breakdown is what you come here for, subscribe to Frontline Truth. We analyze the mechanics of this war, the doctrine, the equipment, the operational logic, every week. The war is not won or lost in headlines. It is won or lost in exactly these kinds of engagements, and understanding them is the only way to understand what is actually happening.